I would ask both Alan and Martina to talk a little bit about how they got started with this. I mean, when you become a documentary filmmaker or DP, it's kind of like you're joining the circus, you know? So how and why did you join the circus, and who wants to go first?
I guess I'll start. I started in the legitimate side of the circus business first, in narrative feature films. I was a gaffer for many years, doing lighting on Sundance-y kind of features in New York, indie movies in the 90s, and it was going well. I've always enjoyed lighting. It was kind of my entree into the work, and so but it was getting big. I was working on bigger projects, and I was doing less actual hands-on work and more crew management and managing gear and logistics and all that. And I got to the point one day where I remember going into scouting a bar that we were going to shoot in, and I thought, well, I can't do this without 27 tweenies and 3 trucks and a whole crew. And I thought, what have I become? And so I made a pretty conscious decision to pivot into documentary to try to get back in touch with the idea of spontaneity and instinct, and get back in touch with embracing natural light in the available moments, the kind of the in-between moment that has been beaten out of a lot of narrative work. So that's what I kind of started trying to be less of a circus, and then I came back to docs. So the great thing about that, for I think the work that I'm attracted to now, is that there's kind of this wonderful collision of more structured, almost narrative cinematic techniques seeping into docs, and so I'm able to lean on some of the first things I was doing in terms of crafting a strong look or bringing cinematic camera movement or lighting into documentaries, and I think that's really exciting. So anyway, that's how I ended up here.
Cool. Martina, do you have a...
Yeah, I also started out in the fiction world. I'm originally from Berlin, so I worked as an assistant camera for a long time in feature films. And assistant is pretty much the job when nobody talks to you when you do a good job, but oh boy, when something goes wrong, everybody talks to you. And then eventually, I tried to become a DP, and that was very hard in Berlin at the time for various reasons. And so I moved here. And I worked in fiction for a while, but then started to go back and forth between fiction and documentary. And it's, everybody always asks me, I'm sure you get the same question, like, what do you like better? And it's really, I never really think about it being that different. Obviously, yes, you have the 27 trucks and you have a team and so forth, and that's really fun, and I miss that part of it sometimes. But the spontaneous and like just being in real moments and having to react quickly on your feet with the people around you, that is really, that's satisfying. And there's, when you get these moments, they're just so gratifying when like everything comes together, like the light is perfect, you're in the right spot, and the action is unfolding in a way that you've never anticipated, or you maybe anticipated, and then it happens. It's like, that is so gratifying. You don't get that really in fiction.
So I'm assuming neither one of you is shooting with 3 trucks and 27 tweenies these days.
All the time.
Hopefully not.
Now, Alan, your recent film documentary that you shot was Strong Island, and that has a very strong look to it. And I know that you brought some clips of that to show us. Do you want to talk about, has everybody here seen Strong Island or know about it? Raise your hand if you've seen it. If you haven't, it's a Netflix original, so you can watch it tonight when you get home. So for those who don't know about it, do you want to talk a little bit about the film and how you came up with the look?
Sure. So Strong Island is the story of the filmmaker Yance Ford's family, and a tragedy that happened to Yance's brother, who was a 19-year-old black man shot and killed 20 years ago in an altercation over a car repair that was taking too long at an auto body shop. And Yance takes that moment and as a way to kind of examine this idea of the flaws in our justice system, but also a cultural moment where this idea of reasonable fear and who gets to define reasonable fear, because there's even 20 years ago in 1992 when Yance's brother William was killed, someone with a gun could claim that they were scared to the point of from an unarmed person and shoot them and have no consequence. So examining that idea of reasonable fear and whose fear is reasonable in our culture where there's a power imbalance right off the bat. And Yance was, Yance had worked for a decade at POV, helping to curate the POV strand on PBS. And at one of our first meetings, Yance said, I realized that Yance had seen literally every American documentary made in the last 10 years. And he said very clearly, like, I don't want to do any of those. So we, from the start, I had a really strong imperative to try to find something distinctive for the reason of telling this story in a way that was maybe a little more disarming or a little bit more through the back door in terms of the kind of, grieving black mother story, or not to reduce it to that, but so the aesthetics were always paramount in our design of the film, and that ultimately led to we came up with a set of rules. We had literally like 10 or 12 rules written down on paper that to kind of control the look of the film. And I'm a big believer in limitation, especially in documentary, because there's so much going on, and every location is unique and every moment is unique, that I find that having some kind of aesthetic rules really help guidepost how I'm going to cover a room or a moment. And when things are going crazy, it's just, I find it really kind of reassuring to be like, okay, I don't need to swing over there and get all that thing. I can stick with my plan here. So we had some rules. One of the main rules in the film was that the camera was never going to pan or tilt. And the idea with this was to kind of create this sense in the audience, this experiential sense that you don't get to see everything in the film, the same way the family wasn't privy to all of the way the system was not working for them. So we thought a lot about letting the action kind of come into the frame and also move out of the frame. And if somebody moved out of the frame, the camera's not allowed to follow them. You don't get to follow everything. And this idea of kind of controlling the audience's viewpoint to, maybe a little bit of sense of frustration, that we realize we can't quite see everything. So that was kind of an aesthetic importance to the film. And that happens a couple times where, you want to see around the corner. And it's a very emotional reaction, I think, for audiences, because we're so used to things being presented very cleanly and very, this like Hollywood rule of you got to say something 3 times or people aren't going to get it. We were trying for just the opposite of that. And I feel that as an audience member, it's the kind of film I like to see that asks me and trusts me a little bit more, to ask me to bring my own work to the viewing. It's not going to be presented for me, and I have to work a little bit harder. And I feel that when you offer that to your audience and trust them to be able to fill in the gaps with their own experience, you get a much better, buy-in. People are filling in the gaps with their own experience, and it's hopefully a little bit more empathetic and a little bit more relatable, because we haven't had a family member killed, but by having to fill in the gaps of how that actually might have went down, maybe you bring more of your own story to it. So it's kind of a less is more approach for me right now that I'm excited about.
Should we show the clips and then we can talk more about it? Okay.
Yeah.
Can we show the strong? So what you were talking about earlier with creating restrictions for yourself, you can, especially in that first scene, you can see how much control you have over everything, and it's striking. You hear voices, but you don't see anybody on camera, on screen talking to you. You just, it's all very interior.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about? It's like interior monologue.
Right. And there are moments in the film where, for our interviews where we met the family members, we presented those in a very, what we started calling kind of a testimony frame, where the frame's very wide and the subject centered framed, and the shots linger, and you're kind of they're given an agency to tell their story in a way that they weren't when the investigation was happening. So there's that counterpoint. But yeah, so by setting up that construct, we were able to play off of it this other one, which is that people you're not allowed to see everything, and people are coming and going, and you're hearing things while you're seeing something else. And I just really believe that, you know, having that little bit of a remove from the audio and the visual lets, again, the audience kind of make the connections themselves, and you bring more of your own experience to it. So yeah, I just think it's a really powerful device to kind of take one step removed from the sync sound.
And then with the second clip, I mean, obviously it's a very powerful moment, and I think Yance did not expect to get Hughes on the phone at that day, and so I think maybe you guys were planning on just talking to the answering machine, and then all of a sudden something different happened, and you had to kind of react to it. I mean, it's just curious, what was filming that sequence like, and what decisions did you make in terms of, because there's some, you changed the framing a few times there when emotional stuff is going on.
Right. So the phone calls were something that Yance had been putting off for years, because Yance, who, unless folks don't know, when we filmed the film, Yance was identifying as a female, as a sister and a daughter. Now he's a brother and a son. He's transitioned. So, in case the pronouns are confusing, but so
when something like that happens, I mean, to have it's an intense moment.
Right.
A lot of times somebody would just kind of stay with the same angle, and here you're, I mean,
yeah.
Very nicely making some.
Because part of the approach of having this idea of these lingering frames that that the audience can sit with is that you can only, if you're doing that, you can't. There's not a way to cut around that. So we're always working with two cameras in those situations. So two cameras, pretty much identical lensing. I was working with. We made a choice to work with a still photo tripod, a small geared head that's designed for still photography, like architectural photography, 3-axis geared head. And the point of that was it's impossible to do like a smooth pan or a tilt. And since we didn't want any pans or tilts in the film, that kept me honest about not wimping out when I would frame something up and then someone would move. There was no way for me to accommodate that. So it was a way of, again, giving myself a limitation so that so that I couldn't, wuss out of trying to stick to that. So with two cameras, I was able to leapfrog like that, and it was me and Yance in that room, and I would set up one shot that was interesting and hope that maybe Yance's face would come in or out of that frame or stay there and be in focus, and then I would, tiptoe over to the other camera, which is 3 feet away, and set that up and try to do something interesting there and hope something happened there, and then would go back to the other camera. So like in those kind of verite, that's what we call a verite scene, 80% of those shots were made when I wasn't even looking at the camera because I was doing the other one. So it was kind of shooting blind, and again, embracing that and making it okay to miss something or have it be too edgy or not quite there. Because it was part of this idea that not everything is going to be perfect. Did that answer the question? Yeah, and we didn't know when those phone calls would land because most of the time you'd call and just get someone's voicemail or they'd never call you back, and some people have complained that feels a little too constructed because how could you get those moments so close? But that's exactly how it happened, and with two cameras, we were able to kind of cover it, getting increasingly tight.
Well, you created a safety net for yourself with the two cameras. Now, I mean, I guess you anticipated something might happen, but you just never knew when it would happen.
Right. Yeah. So, but it was about having rules and then taking comfort in those rules, right? So, if we had missed something, it would have been okay because aesthetically it was still in line with what we were doing. And when you have the hundreds of other hours that we were doing also in that vein, it becomes a choice, and it's not a mistake. It's a choice. So, again, that's the power of rules, I think. And then you get the awesome advantage of being able to break a rule when you want to. So,
well, let's we'll come back to Strong Island, but let's let Martina tell us how a little bit about her own documentary portrait that she shot about some in a very different vein. This is a documentary following Obama in his last year, or the last year of Obama's presidency. Do you want to tell the final year?
It's the last year of Obama's foreign policy. So, because Obama was always criticized for his foreign policy, right? And Greg Baker, the director, had a relationship with Samantha Powers already through another film, which I cannot recall the title right now, sorry. So it was his idea to actually show what politicians are doing, because we don't know that really, right? It's like we see them in the news all the time, but we don't know what it is that they're doing and why it's not working, because all we see it's not working. Which was also like the speaking about making a portrait, that was the biggest challenge. How do we differentiate the film from regular news footage with the restricted access that we have? I mean, what's amazing about the film is that we had access, but within having the access, it was very restricted because they were actually running a country, so they weren't just there for us. So
You mean you couldn't set up two cameras around Obama and just go back and
Excuse
forth?
me, can you do that again, please? No, we could not do that. But that's what I like about your work, because there's so much faith in your own vision, and also the trust and the patience that you have to have, right? If you shoot a film in that restriction, which I just wanted to say that because it's really impressive to me. Yeah, that was not the case with Obama. So for us, it was really like, how do we make these people real? How do we make these people and take them off that usual screen of like getting off the airplane and having a 3/4 close up.
wow, such access. That's amazing.
That last shot where you held the camera and just let him walk out the frame, you hold on the shot, right? That's always, it's great.
But that's the thing, not to get distracted by the action, right? It's like, it's so easy to fall for the action, when half the time it's much better to just stay, let it happen, let it unfold, and then react.
Yeah, because otherwise you would be like an ENG camera person, right? Where it's like, okay, I got to get my 15 shots, instead of like saying, okay, I'm going to pick my spot, and this is where I'm going to get.
Well, I mean, I have to say with that last interview, because that was in Athens, and that was after we had learned that Trump won the election. So that was, the Athens trip was a whole victory parade in terms of like going back to the cradle of democracy, and then, well, we all know what happened. So, we were shooting. We had like, they gave us 5 minutes behind the scene, so you're like literally backstage. There was nothing that made the shot interesting. And Greg Baker, the director, always had the tendency to go really close to the interview. I mean, to the people. Again, to break that, I am not the news. I'm not sitting here in a safe distance. I'm in your face, and I want to really know what you have to say. So both of these men were 6 foot something, and then there's me, right? So like shooting up at Obama, I'm like, oh, this is shooting into his nose. Behind him is the light. It's the ugliest shot you can imagine, and you're standing there, and what do I do? It's like there's no redoing. There's no, I'm sorry, can I? Right? So you just go with it. But then the end of the shot really made it, especially knowing, him saying, "Are we out of here?" Like he was out of there, right? It was the end. So that is one of those happy accidents, but you have to have the patience for it, and you have to trust that this is somehow going to work, even so you're in the wrong spot. The director's nose tip was constantly in the frame, and it was like, but you have to trust it, and then good things happen.
there's magic in those in-between moments.
Yeah.
You know, the part that you think would just get cut out in a typical
Right.
edit, but holding on things and
Right.
letting it come to you, that really magic can happen. Yeah.
I mean, that's the one beauty, I mean, you know, that really about digital, you can let it roll, right? Never switch off the camera. I mean, obviously, don't just roll, but just because somebody said, like, okay, that's it, you know, you don't switch off the camera. Again, patience, trust.
Yeah, so it's interesting to watch these, you know, two very different examples of documentary and kind of the different types of decision making that you have to make. I mean, in your case, you had a lot more control. This was, you know, you had a number of years you were filming this, and for you, you had to figure out how to make decisions within actions that were happening that you could not do later.
Well, that's sort of why I choose that second clip. I know it was a lot of still images and so forth, but you know, the thing is, we go out because Obama is going to Fort so-and-so and is having his last speech to the troops, and you have no idea how they're going to use that in the film. Right? So and then it's happening, and then there's a detail, and then there's like a gazillion people, and again, it's like tiny me with my tiny camera trying to tell a story while something is unfolding that I have no idea what the story is actually about. So all I could think about was you have to react very quickly, right? You watch these people like in tears that they meet Obama and understanding that they really see him as their leader. And he really feels that responsibility. I mean, you see that when they connect. So then the only thing I could come up with was like, okay, let's change perspective here, right? Like, let's be behind Obama and see the troops from his perspective, but then jump into the crowd and look at him as one of them, and then hoping that that's going to make sense in the story, and it happened to work, right? It happened to make sense. Like that idea of what do you do with one of those public moments where you have no idea how they're going to use that later in the film. And the director can't know that yet. I mean, obviously there's always an idea, but it's a very vague idea when you follow people like the administration.
And I don't know if you want to, we promised not to talk about equipment, but we were talking about the camera you shot that film with, and your director had this idea that shooting with a small camera, somehow you'd get greater access. And
well, again, it was twofold. It was always because it took, I mean, we shot that, it's called The Final Year, and we literally shot for 1 year, on and off, obviously. But it took the people who worked in the administration 6 months to understand that we're not the press. They would always constantly put us with the press corps, and then I would just turn around and shoot the press corps because we didn't want that. Right? And then that was pretty impressive. Like when 120 people come towards you with a camera and they are ruthless. But the idea was we're not the press, so we don't have the big shoulder camera that everybody would have. And so we were shooting with the Sony, what is it?
A7S.
A7S.
I hated that camera so much I can't remember the name.
Sony reps, please cover your ears.
It has nothing to do with Sony, sorry. But it's just, it was too small for me because it's very hard to see when you're constantly in motion. Anyway, so the idea was to really distinguish ourselves and be very unobtrusive and very, not threatening them and really trying to get the private moments. And that was the decision, to shoot on that camera.
But that was a director's decision based on thinking that it would help with access rather than...
Yes. I mean, I do think it did eventually. It did help, and they sort of accepted us eventually. So Ben Rhodes was the main factor who, on some point, he's Obama's speechwriter. At some point, he was like, wait, nobody will ever remember any speech I wrote, but people will remember a film, and that turned things around. And it did help that we just looked different than the press.
And it feels different.
Yeah.
The fact that camera's small and that you're close and you're being jostled, like you feel it.
I mean, that
translates into the shot.
Running around with Carrie, and so he was Samantha was really fine. Like we had a lot, really active.
Samantha Powers, yeah.
Yes, sorry. With Carrie, But there were moments where, I mean, he was in the hotel and suddenly decided he wanted to walk around the block because he never gets to see anything really. And then suddenly 60 people are walking. And you're in Vienna and I have no idea where I'm going. And, and that helped with the small camera. And again, that the constant being on standby and constantly being ready. So in that sense, it was the right camera for that film.
And
or like sneak, what do you do when somebody just walks around, sneaking in like a shot where you just let him go? Like, again, it's like this restriction, right? Like, I only have him for 5 minutes, so I have to stick next to him. And it was like, no, you don't. Like, let him go and then shoot an interesting shot of him spiraling down, because Syria was literally spiraling down. And so, again, that camera was helpful to do these shots and then run after him, right, and catch up again. Like.
Yeah, you didn't have 30 pounds to lug around with you.
Right.
I was just going to say, it's a good example of letting the equipment follow the story needs instead of the other way around. You know, think about aesthetically what the film needs and what it wants, and then find the equipment that can make that happen.
Right.
I try to leave that equipment decision till the very end. Sometimes even like the night before, like, oh, wait a minute, what am I doing? Because it should serve the story first.
No, I have to admit, it's like I was fighting Greg. I was like, well, but like the F5 is so much better and the resolution, and he's like, no, and he was right.
Can we talk about Strong Island? Now, that second scene with the phone call, were those fixed lenses you were using?
I was using the EF 70-200 lenses, but with diopters that can allow you to focus closer, so you can get those lenses much closer.
And a lot of, very limited depth of field.
Yeah, they basically compress the range of depth of field and they bring it forward into a closer thing, and then they take away your ability to go to infinity, so everything kind of gets mushy. But so the effect is that it's a very limited thing, and then there's some distortion around the edges. It's kind of a
I think for your story it really works because you want to get inside people's heads, and it was there's a narrative film, Son of Saul, about the Auschwitz, and that was all shot on a 55, 1.4, 1.2, and so a lot of the time the characters are going in and out of focus, but it brings you very much into the experience of the main character. And I felt a similar thing with that decision that you made in terms of the depth of field.
Yeah, it was kind of, it just kind of happened that way. But yeah, the diopters were an essential part of that. Which, pro tip, I found that because they take away your ability to go to infinity, you don't want it on all the time. So I wouldn't use a matte box or anything. I would just put a loop of tape around the lens and just slot them in, like basically pull them in and out at a moment's notice. It was interesting, very low tech approach, but it worked.
Low tech and working are two things that we like here. We were talking earlier about how we live in a great time to make documentary because people are exploring making documentary in lots of different ways, incorporating narrative technique, and telling different kinds of stories. Do you guys want to talk a little bit about, just the breadth of options available to cinematographers today?
Well, I think we're living in really interesting times in terms of documentary because we're branching out, and documentary is not that clear cut. It's about a topic and somebody tells you something about the topic and then you get some B-roll and so forth. It's what we said before. Fiction has different categories, right? Why should documentary not? That's where also the artistic choice comes in, right? You can tell a true story, because documentary is all about truth, right? You can tell a true story many different ways.
And some people get upset that this kind of hybrid stuff is somehow not true or not real. Documentary's never been real or true. There's always some level of manipulation. So I think from the way I like to think about it is that these techniques are giving the more control to the audience to bring your own ideas into it. If you're seeing, this kind of much more subjective material on the screen, you can subject yourself, to your own ideas. So I think it's in a way that kind of poetry versus prose leaves a lot more up to the reader, and that the form of the poetry is part of the story. That the new forms in doc that are happening now, I think, are where the form of the cinematic storytelling can be part of the story. I just think is really powerful because it works on multiple levels within the viewer, I think.
Well, I think in Strong Island we see that, that it's a testimonial film, right, in some ways, and then the way that you guys shot it emphasizes that idea.
Yeah, I should say that I talked about the 10 rules we started with at the beginning of the 7 years. 2 of the rules were Yance will not appear in the film, and there will be no close-ups in the film. And we worked with that for 4 years. Yance was not in it, and there was no close-ups. But, that's the one good thing about rules is then when you break them, you can really do it powerfully.
But that's also why films take 7 years, right? Because you grow into them and the film grows with you, and I'm sure it would have never been as good if you would have finished it after 4 years.
Right. There were like 3 years where, it was expected that we were going to take it to apply to Sundance, submit it for Sundance. And each of those 3 years we were like, don't want to rush it. And that's a long time to wait, but for the right reasons. The film takes the amount of time it takes, and I think you should let it.
Well, that's a tough decision to make for a filmmaker to say, like, I'm going to wait another year, right? I mean, and I think a lot of us in this room, when you get to that, it's August or September, and it's like, well, I don't know, are we ready? Is this the film we want to send? But I think it shows a lot of maturity to say no, we're going to wait.
But I think the question is really, is it the best film it can be, rather than is it the film I want to make? I mean, obviously those are connected.
As far as Martina, in terms of doing different things with the documentaries, and I mean, are there any films you've seen recently that you've enjoyed what they've done with the narrative or with the technique?
Well, I've seen Hale County twice. Hale County this afternoon, because again, it's a very different approach to seeing and what's around you, and it's really inviting you to look at something and experiences rather than telling a story. Or Minding the Gap. Is it Minding the Gap? Yeah, Minding the Gap. I really loved a lot. For the personal, and then that's the thing. It's like the audience also has changed. It's not just that documentary has changed. You can't. I'm still a huge fan of variety documentaries, but you can't tell anybody anymore that there's no camera in the room. I mean, we're all so sophisticated now, and we have been trained how to view films and documentaries, and we all know there's a camera in the room. So even if it's a variety film, there's a camera in the room. So that immediately takes out the element of objectivity. Right? So, for example, Minding the Gap is a personal documentary, and I thought it was so beautiful how how the director incorporated himself halfway through the film, and how the film started out as one thing and then became something else, although it was always there lingering.
Yeah, this issue of objectivity, subjectivity seems to have been. I mean, there's been a conversation about that for the last 50 years, and I get, at a certain point, I mean, there are people that thought that there was something, I mean, there was true objectivity, which we all know is not. I mean, even Frederick Wiseman is not truly objective. Right. I mean, he appears to, they talk about fly on the wall, verite, but you still have to make a decision about where you're going to put the cameras and what you're going to edit together. And I'm a big fan of the Maisels films, but you look at Grey Gardens and Gimme Shelter, and those films have I mean, Great Gardens, there's a collaboration between the filmmakers and the subjects
Right.
that I think is really interesting.
Right.
So, I mean, do you have any, I mean, obviously, I mean, in terms of Strong Island, you guys made, it's a very subjective film. You know, where, I mean, is there a line for you guys in terms of what you would do in terms of constructing a documentary?
I think for me, as long as it's authentic in its intent, I wouldn't have a problem with it. You know, if we're trying to express something that needs to be said and there's a truth to it, even if it was a constructed device that was saying it, I would want to explore that. I think audiences, like you say, are sophisticated enough to be challenged that way, to be able to, and you're throwing some of the responsibility to the audience to say, wait, what are they doing here? What, am I being taken for a ride, or am I being, you know, and you know, again, I think there's a collaboration there now between the filmmakers that are working in this more kind of open-ended style and the audience. So we're all kind of discovering it together, which I think is going to lead to some great art, like Hale County. I mean, it's amazing, and I've Bisbee 17 is a really interesting take on this idea of constructed reality, and you've got townspeople playing versions of themselves from back in the day. I mean, Robert Greene's doing some really interesting stuff.
Mm. But I mean, you know, at the end, it's a story, right? We're telling a story, and it's so much about what you don't show, even in a documentary. It's like what you restrict yourself to, and what's outside happening of the frame. But it's also you can never tell the full story. Or I don't even know what that means. So I think there is a general acceptance that nowadays that a documentary is not just a true story. Period. Right? It's a part of something. It's a specific aspect of a story of a person's life. And why not tell it with cinematic ways, even if it's a documentary, even if it's a real character, real person. And especially when something happened in the past. I mean, it's also who wants to see something like real, like real time, right? And then you're back to news.
And it's time for us to be thinking about, while we're watching work, to think about who's holding the camera, what perspective do they have, what is their connection to the community, and I think it's important to be thinking about these things while we're watching art. The idea of everything being, everybody that goes to a Spielberg film, everybody in the theater has the exact same experience at the exact same moment. Everyone cries and at the exact same time, because it's a program that you're on the ride. And we're not thinking too much about how the filmmakers are manipulating us. But I think it's now audiences are wanting more participation in this idea of who's representing this thing that's on the screen.
I also think there's an ethical problem. I mean, we the privileged one can travel all over the world and tell stories of people from all over the world, but they can never tell the stories back, right? So that has to be clear, and it has to be clear to the audience that we have a responsibility as filmmakers to make that clear, to not pretend that this is, a true moment. It's our version of it.
Well, in terms of finding the truth that you're going to tell, the truth that you are creating for the film, I mean, the cinematographer works closely with the director, the producer. Can you talk a little bit about that relationship, in terms of how you work with other people, or I guess how you find the balance, right?
Foremost, our job is to cater to the vision of the director. And so you ideally, before you even start shooting, you have an agreement that and that's where the trust comes in, right? That you really both want to make the same film. I mean, as a cinematographer, you want to make that film that the director wants to make. Because if you don't have that, then I don't know how you can trust each other.
Yeah, and I try to think of myself as an ally to the director's vision,
Right.
and I have to let my ego drop away, and when it's working well, the director and I are both reinforcing each other and keeping each other honest. And if I'm having an insecure moment, that my director will prop me up. And if the director is wavering, I can say, hey, remember we talked about wanting to do it this way. Oh yeah. And it's this mutual support system that really has to be developed, I think. And part of that is that as cinematographers, I think we have to kind of let our ego fall away and kind of crawl into the mind of the director and try to be them for a while and see the way they see. And so which I think is an exhilarating part of the art. I mean, I get to work with, I like to work with directors that have a really strong point of view and a strong vision, and they may not know exactly how to show that or to get it, and I can help with that. But if they have that strong vision, I can just crawl inside that and really become one with that idea. It's really thrilling.
And run with they have a vision, and then it's like, okay, well, this is how we're going to execute it.
Yeah, what do you think about this? Or wouldn't it be interesting? And then the dialogue that happens is where, a good idea becomes really great. And then you just give them all the credit at the end.
And then they go home with the Oscar. Well, I have been notified that it is time for Q&A.
I'll repeat the question. It's asking, since Yance ended up being in the film after all, did I find my role changing in terms of how to maintain the vision maybe when Yance was doing something else? Again, because we were of such one mind and we had spent so much time developing our language and our shorthand, and remember it was 4 years that Yance was not distracted in the film. So when that happened, it kind of happened seamlessly. But again, we had this trust, so I was able to push a little bit and say, like, well, we have this second camera. I'll sneak a shot of Yance here, and then it made it to the editor, and now it's in the film, and Yance could kind of see, how that could feel. So, yeah, there's, like I said, when there's trust there, you can push each other and make little baby steps. It took 4 years to get Yance into the film, but yeah, that's collaboration and trust, which is so important.
I'm in the business of creating content for businesses and really kind of what you're doing, short little documentaries around their why and why they're in their business and the impact that they're trying to have in the world. And I think a lot of us here are cinematographers or the filmmakers. How does one create that trust with the person that they're filming really quickly? And in my case, in a matter of days or weeks. And I know you had 4 years with Yance, and I'm not sure how long you had with with Samantha and et cetera. But do you have any advice on that?
Talk early and often without the camera. Talk about kids, talk about food, talk about life. Connect with those things that were all universal, and then. Then maybe by the time the camera comes out, they've forgotten that they're supposed to be clammed up around you. I don't know. But time always helps, I think. How do you connect?
Just be foremost the person, second the filmmaker.
A great mentor and friend of mine was Albert Maysles, and some of you probably know his classic film Salesman. In Salesman, they were following door-to-door Bible salesmen in Florida in 1963. And so imagine a door-to-door Bible salesman is knocking on a door, and there's a documentary crew shooting 16 millimeter with them, right? And so if you watch this film, it's one of the most amazing, intimate verite documentaries ever. And so, I mean, I asked Albert, how did you do this, And he said, and Albert was a very charming guy and had a great smile. And he said that when the door opened, the salesman would ask if he could come in, and then Albert would look out from behind the viewfinder and just kind of like smile and give them a look, and sort of just reassure them like it's going to be okay. So I think a lot of it's just to be open and friendly. I mean, because a lot of times you're walking into situations where you're not going to have time to talk to somebody beforehand. It's just, how do you make somebody feel at ease right away? I think a lot of it is just the way that you interact with other people in general, with or without a camera. Anyway, that was Albert's. Just give him a smile.
Hi, this question is for Alan. It's a little bit of an open-ended question, but when I was watching the first sample from Strong Island, some of the pacing and the feel of it was making me think of certain narrative cinema, kind of in the French New Wave tradition, where you sort of go against the grain of, as you said later, the manipulative kind of idea, where you might hold a little too long or create intentional awkwardness with the still image so long, where you almost kind of go like, oh, is it stuck? Are we supposed to wait? No, there's still movement. Okay, we're still and the sort of idea with that in narrative is to kind of break the illusion and show you that this is a film. Again, to kind of go against what's normally the idea, is to create the illusion. Yet in documentary, it would seem there's maybe the mission statement's kind of different, because it's a film and you're not really trying. And then, or are you? Because like documentary is kind of trying to make you get lost in the story, and perhaps it works in just the same way to try and create a seamlessness and to efface its, cover the jump cuts and all those kinds of things. So I just wonder if you could talk a little more about exposing the apparatus, kind of, and what that means in this context, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. We were very interested in kind of challenging the audience this way, to let the gaze linger in a way that goes beyond kind of the normal insert shot length, and that, if there's this moment where you're like, wait, what is this? Is it stuck, or am I supposed to still be looking at this? Once that uncomfortableness passes and the shot continues, I feel like we start having to look at it closer and fill in the gaps. And why am I being presented with this for this length? One of our rules, again, with the rules, one of our rules was, whenever a shot was framed up, we would roll for 60 seconds. Even if 10 seconds in I'd realize that, it's not what I wanted, or it's not going to work, or still would let it go 60 seconds. For this idea that then the editor would have the choice to let these things play out and confront the audience in that way. Because I think, in some of the narrative film and some of the global work that's happening, where like somebody like Bella Tarr is like holding these shots for, these incredible shots where you have to look at it and you see it and you understand it, and then you have to go a little further and you have to see it again and understand it again, and you get a couple of layers in there when something's held that long. So that pacing was very important. So I hope it worked for you. It's I distinctly remember while we were shooting, I would sometimes say to Yance, like, listen, if we do this shot or whatever, this sequence like this, it's going to piss people off, and like people are going to like walk out of the theater. And Yance, this is why the vision of a director is so important. Yance would say, if somebody walks out of the theater, I'm not making this film for them. If they're not going to invest in what we're trying to do here, this film's not for them. And I just like that kind of vision and rigor from your director is like gold, because then you're really going to go for it.
All right, I've been notified we have time for one final question.
I have a question for Alan. You worked on this film for such a long time, and I see that you're also credited as an associate producer. And watching the film, there are so many moments where the cinematography really reinforces this internal thought process and recollection. You really get inside Yance's head. Can you talk a little bit about the process? I mean, I imagine you were also looking at cuts and listening to audio cuts and thinking about things like in that first clip where the sprinkler, takes us through that moment where they discover that Mr. Ford is dead. Can you talk about how you worked on perhaps reverse engineering as well, and what the process was like?
Boy, it's hard to have to put it in words, I guess. Because Yance and I had gotten so close and had spent so much time together, and for a lot of the film, it was just the two of us. It was not a big operation. And so, I would kind of help. Yance and I would have long discussions, hours-long discussions about what we, Yance would say, we have to go back out to the house, and I gotta repair the chimney, and I want to film that. And so then we'd have hours discussions about what we wanted to get out of that, not the story of the house, but the house as a character, and spending a lot of time thinking about not so much what we needed to shoot or what it needed to look like, but what it wanted to feel like. And so that freed me up to then when we're on location and I see a sprinkler and then in the yard, I don't have to think like, oh, it's not, I'm not illustrating a moment about watering the lawn. I'm going with a feeling. So then I could be open to seeing things that with this idea of how do you photograph loss or regret or, grief, to film, how do you film someone a moment of, they're realizing the dad was dead, it's kind of impossible. So by having an open-ended palette of emotion to kind of shoot for, I think that's kind of how it happened. And there wasn't a lot of communication between Yance and I at that point. I'd be outside and Yance would be fixing the chimney and I'd be making some shots. And, because I knew how Yance saw, how his eyes worked at that point, I could kind of make things happen like that. And there was another brilliant point I was going to make, but I forgot, but it'll come back. Let's talk after.
You can call us tomorrow and tell us what that brilliant point was. Maybe to wrap out, maybe just briefly, the both of you could talk about what you're working on or excited about right now. Just a little quick hit. Is there anything fun you guys? No
all
fun
great.
for Alan?
I mean, I got the greatest job because everything is super interesting, even when it's not. What can I talk about?
Well, Martina, you're going to Montana, right?
Yeah.
We don't need.
It's the new thing in documentaries that you have to sign non-disclosure.
It's so cool, but sadly we can't tell you about it.
I could talk about. I did a Netflix series that's going to go on Netflix at the end of the month called Murder Mountain. It's a story of the legal weed operation in Northern California, Humboldt County, and how that culture, which has been the epicenter of the American pot industry for 60 years, is changing with California making it legal. So we were up in the mountains with a lot of outlaws and isolationists and this really, really closed community. And so it's an interesting take on a lot of these issues. But we was able to slip in some kind of more, ethereal imagery. We had this idea of evocative B-roll instead of strict B-roll. So there's some interesting stuff in there.
I mean, I just came back from Nepal where I was shooting a sort of bio doc about the first Sherpa woman who summited Mount Everest. And that is, what happens a lot lately is that you make film about people who are not around anymore, so they can't talk for themselves, and that's really when you have to visually create a character. which I find challenging and exciting. Yep, and I'm also working on my own first feature-length stock as a director. So that's 10 years in the making. So,
So 10 years from now, we'll have a conversation about it.
No, please don't. In a year from now.
All right. Well, Martina and Alan, thank you very much. Let's give them a round of applause.
Thank you, Hugo.
If you have a pressing question, it's possible they might be out in the lobby for a few minutes.